I picked up this book not too long ago and I started flipping through the pages. And one of the first lines I read said this: "There is no such thing as a trivial connection." Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. Man, I deeply agree with that. My soul shook a little bit when I read that line. There is no such thing as a trivial connection. No, connections are sacred. Our little moments of being with each other, even in the midst of our ordinary lives, in our ordinary towns, with our ordinary jobs, while we're wearing our ordinary clothes, those little ordinary moments of being with each other are sacred. They are not trivial. You are going to love this episode. I am so glad you're here. Hi, everyone. This is your host, Matt Matson. Welcome to this episode of the Between Podcast. We made this one just for you. Hey, I'm going to dive right into our conversation today because I have read all three of the books that our guest has put out into the world. And when I say I've read them, what I really mean is that I have soaked in these books. I have sat with a big dumb smile on my face and absorbed every single word. I love the work from today's guest. These books are just incredible. Her brain is incredible. Her writing is beautiful. She's one of my absolute favorite authors, and I cannot wait to introduce her to you all. Let me start by sharing the titles of Shannan Martin's three books so that you all can immediately go to your local bookstore or library and find them. Falling Free, I think, was your first book, Shannan. Falling Free, the subtitle of that was Rescued from a Life I Always Wanted. Then came the second book, The Ministry of Ordinary Places, Waking Up to God's Goodness All Around You. And finally, your most recent title, and the book that I actually found first, is titled Start with Hello and Other Simple Ways to Live as Neighbors. Shannan Martin, your writing is beautiful and urgent, I think, and raw. And most importantly to me, it inspires practical action. It calls us to love our neighbors in immediate and gritty ways. I love it all. And I'm so grateful to have you here. Will you, I don't know, let's start by giving our listeners a glimpse inside your daily life.
Well, Matt, thank you. That's so kind. Thank you for having me on. I look forward to the conversation. Okay. What does my everyday life look like? Every day is always a little different. I am the mom of three teenagers. So that is, and as we spoke a little bit before we started recording, it's January in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my everyday life right now is dictated by Mother Nature. But generally speaking, I work 2 days outside of the home at a community kitchen just a mile up the street from me in Goshen, Indiana, where I live. And I'm a cook there. So 2 days a week, that's the work that I'm doing. My hair is under a ball cap, and we're making food for 120 people, 130 people every day. And that's work that's really meaningful to me. And maybe we'll talk more about that as we go. The other 3 days, I am, mothering children. I am connecting with neighbors. I am doing this part of my work. So my authoring work, whether that's writing or, working on a Substack post or recording a podcast or avoiding all of those things and puttering around the house instead. I'm fortunate. I think as an author, I get to count reading as work. And so I do a whole lot of reading, not so much during the day, but that's a part of my day's rhythm for sure. My husband, Corey, is the full-time chaplain of the Elkhart County Jail. And our family moved into this neighborhood and into this home a little over 12 years ago. And all three of my books have been written here. So I like to say I found my voice in the country and my story in the city. So our family used to live, 20 minutes from here, short in distance, but very different in terms of kind of, the culture, the place, the ethos of the place. And when we moved into this neighborhood, everything in our life shifted. And you know that because you've read the whole series.
Yeah, the trilogy,
So,
the Shannan Martin trilogy.
Yes, the trilogy. And I think it's pretty cool that you actually read Start with Hello first, because they work well to read them in order, but they also work just fine reading them out of order. But you kind of got the went about it as many people did. Many people found me through Start with Hello, and I think that's pretty great. So thank you for being one of those people who found that work and then went back and read the back catalog. That's what every author wants, I think.
Well, I think what's kind of cool is that the Start with Hello, I literally was in my local Barnes and Noble, like walked over to the religion section and sort of looked past 90% of the books in that section. I was just looking for something that would, I was like, is there anything out there that connects with this thing that I'm doing, this between project,
Yeah.
this global, faith community that is focused on human connection? Is there anything out there like that? And sure, there's actually a handful of really cool, really current authors. But then I noticed the title Start with Hello, and I was like, well, that seems really directly related. I'm going to pull this out. And went home and started reading that night. And I think I told you earlier before we started recording, like I was almost like confused because your writing was so familiar. The places and people you were writing about was so familiar. I grew up in the Midwest, not terribly far from where you live
Yeah.
now. And so many of the ideas were so closely aligned with ideas that I feel like I've been trying to communicate in clunkier ways for years, but you were just so artfully crafting sentences and
Yeah.
stories and lessons that were so practical. And then, yeah, going back, I felt like I wanted to read. So, who is this person that
Mhm.
wrote these to me brilliant ideas? And your other two books are very much like a backstory. They really
Yeah,
are. They're
they
they're
really
your
are.
life
Yeah.
journey.
Yep.
So, will you walk us through maybe that journey of your family's life? And there, I know there's
Hmm.
lots of details to share, and uh, but I feel like it's important to name where you used to live,
Yeah.
maybe the identity you had as a
Yeah.
blogger then, and how that evolved, and maybe um, pretty dramatically evolved by
Yeah.
moving to where you are now, why you made that move, how your kids came into your life, that kind of stuff. Can you walk
Yeah.
us through some of that journey that your family's been on?
Yeah. I'd love to. Um, Boy, it's always one of those things of like, what's the most succinct way I can tell this story?
Right.
Anyway, and I'll do my best, and you can jump into anybody who is interested to know more. I really do tell the whole story
Mhm.
in my first two books. So we lived at the time, just I think of my life very much as before moving to this neighborhood in this house and after. And it is a defining moment in my family's life. It has come to, I think, in so many ways, the life we lived previously, which was, you know, a pretty homogenous existence.
Mm.
It was my husband and I were both born and raised in the Midwest, both raised in very small, tight knit, white, conservative evangelical communities. I grew up in Ohio, he grew up here in Indiana, but our upbringings were very, they mirrored each other really well.
Mm.
And so that's the path that we were on. We were just doing the things and climbing the ladders and moving towards financial success as best we could. And we both were working in politics and federal politics. We lived for a short time in Washington, D.C., and then moved back to Indiana and bought our dream farmhouse where we thought we would live forever. And at some point, we just had a real moment of reckoning when we started to feel like maybe we were missing something important.
Mm.
This life that we had built for ourselves that was very comfortable in almost every sense of the word. And it doesn't mean, I don't think life is ever easy. I think every life is fraught with complexity and pain and, all of those things that just come with being human. And so I don't remember feeling at the time like my life is just so easy. I
Mhm.
never felt that way. What I did experience, whether I acknowledged it or not, was that I had lived forever in spaces where the people around me looked and lived and believed exactly as I did.
Mm.
And that lack of friction is a certain kind of comfort.
Yeah.
And so at the point that we, kind of stumbled into this idea of like, wait, maybe all of these references that we had both they'd sort of for both of us turned into sort of spiritual white noise of, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. I kind of started to realize that maybe I had looked at it as not hating my neighbor meant loving my neighbor. Maybe
Yeah.
like, is that enough, God? Is that close enough? And starting to understand that that's really how I had approached my faith. It's really how I had approached my life. Like just doing the thing that I was supposed to do, checking the boxes that I was supposed to check, really working towards an American dream life with a side of Jesus.
Yeah.
Everything we were going to do was going to be, sort of air quotes Christian. And that was an important part of us and still is. But that maybe perhaps, we didn't quite understand this idea of loving our neighbors because in so many ways we just had never been pushed.
Hmm.
It's easy to coexist with people who are very similar to you. And so it was kind of that. I'm really distilling a lot down, but it was that idea that maybe we were missing out just on some difference. And really the bigger question of what does the kingdom of God look like and how can we experience some of that richness that ultimately led us to sell that farmhouse and move our very young family at the time into this just kind of rusty, underloved neighborhood
Yeah.
on what most people would consider to be kind of, the wrong side of the tracks in a nearby city. We see it now as very much the right side of the tracks. And it's just an ordinary place. It's just ordinary and special. And so at the point that we made that move, then the real work began because now we were here, we were immersed in new kinds of tension and complexity and difference and trying to really cobble together why does it matter for us to live in connection and in community, and who really is my neighbor, and what is this all about? And so from kind of that mind space, the 3 books in succession came out. And I'm realizing I didn't really answer one of your questions, and it's an important part of the story. At the time that we moved to Goshen, we had 3 children, a preschooler, a kindergartner, and a second grader. And all of our kids came into our family through adoption. So that's just a little bit of, I guess, a unique fact about our family. And this place has now come to really define their childhoods. I mean, at the time, it felt very monumental. We had a lot of people who felt like we were making the biggest mistake of our lives. We were, throwing our kids to the wolves, as they say. There was a lot of pushback for us to make this move. And some of my kids don't even remember anything before this.
Yeah.
We're almost 13 years deep. And then since we've lived here in Goshen, our oldest son came into our family, and he's much older than the rest of them. He just turned 30 yesterday. So yeah, we've got these 4 kiddos. 2 of them, I guess, are sort of technically adults. 2 of them are still in high school, and yeah, we're just doing our best to stay connected to this place and to the people around us.
There are so many things I want to follow up on in just the way that you told that story and in what I also know because I've read the books. But I think I want to lean into, maybe I'll make one comment and then I want to ask you a question. But the comment I want to make is just simply, you've chosen to be so vulnerably open in your books about not just the cool things I think that could teach cool lessons. Like, look at this big thing, this big decision. You're not the hero in the way that you've been vulnerable in your books. You've talked about the hard stuff, including the hard stuff in maybe the before you moved to Goshen part of your life, the hard stuff that led you uh, into the adoption process, the hard stuff
Yeah.
of sort of self-reckoning, I think, over probably multiple life stages. And I think I just wanted to thank you for that vulnerability. It's a model, I think, for a tool that we all need if we want to be good neighbors, if we want to be the kind of people who build community and connection with the people around us. The question I wanted to ask you, I think, is more about your choice to move to Goshen, the as you said, the way many people have called it, the wrong side of the tracks, or maybe that's even how it felt when you first moved there. These ordinary places. There's this quote in Ministry of Ordinary Places that is just one line. You wrote, Ordinary places and average people remind me of everything I'm pretending not to be.
There
And
it is.
yeah, that line shook me because I think I've certainly had many chapters of our family's life where I've been on that safe track, that safe,
Mhm.
bubbly, comfortable, not always easy, but
Yeah.
perfectly manicured, easy-ish track.
Sure.
And a lot of that for me, I think, has been about proving that I'm not ordinary,
Yeah.
proving that I'm not like the town that I grew up in, which of course is even painful to say out loud because I
Yeah.
look at that town today is through a more mature lens and I love every aspect of it, every ordinary part of it. And I just wanted to
Right.
say
Yeah.
that and to ask you more about this idea of ordinary places and average people reminding you of everything that you're pretending not to be.
Yeah, I think our culture does not reward ordinary.
Yeah.
There aren't we don't give special attention to basic things and humble places and people who are just just trying to kind of get through life and facing everything that the day brings them, and trying to care for their families and trying to show up to work every day and trying to not worry about the car repair and figuring out when to get groceries. And
Yeah.
it's this minutia of everyday life that I think most of us live there.
Yeah.
And most of us, if we're being honest, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to run from the identity of ordinary, and at the end of the day it's what we really just all are.
Yes.
But you strip away the things we try to do to outrun that, and those are just things we've kind of been taught to put on. And honestly, you can think of somebody doing spectacular things. I don't know, I mean, everybody I know is doing something
Yeah.
pretty spectacular and heroic and noteworthy. And for me, I lived my whole childhood. This is not something I talk about a whole lot, and it's funny to me now, but I lived my whole childhood and through high school and even started college believing I would be a doctor one day.
Hmm.
That was the path I had put myself on. And so for me, when I think of like, a spectacular life, I think, somebody being a surgeon right now, that seems really spectacular. And it is. Alas, that was not the life for me. But that surgeon at her core, at his core, is just an ordinary person
Yeah.
holding the pieces of a broken world and a beautiful life and saying, I want to make meaning of this
Yeah.
somehow. I want all of this to mean something.
Yes.
And so I just, we moved into this place. And let me give the caveat for any Goshen neighbors listening. Goshen is a wonderful
Yeah.
city. It's like what you say about
Yeah.
your hometown.
Yeah.
And there are places in Goshen that are just, I mean, it is one of the loves of my life. And it's got delicious food and wonderful shops, and everybody should come and meet the good people of Goshen. The neighborhood in particular where we landed was just a place that a lot of people, especially 12 years ago, just might not have chosen.
Yeah.
It just was, there was just not much to say about it. There were a lot of abandoned homes, a lot of decay, that kind of thing. And when we settled in here, when we started sending our kids to the Title I elementary school right up the street, when through a course of events, my husband exited his political career and then became the chaplain of the jail, and our life became infused with people and friends and neighbors who were battling addiction and recovery, who are trying to climb out of poverty, who are at the wrong end of a system that does not want them to succeed, and on it goes. It reoriented my perspective on what I wanted my life to look like and what my life just at its core is.
Yes.
I found myself in a place, and I wish everybody could experience this, and I think there's a way that we can. I suddenly did not have to try to pretend to be anything that I wasn't. There was no expectation. There was no competition or comparison. Nobody cared what my house looked like. Nobody cared if I had done my hair and put on my makeup that day, and nobody cared what cars we drove. And suddenly all these markers of, what the things we do to try to kind of polish ourselves up and present ourselves in a certain way, they just didn't matter anymore. And at that point you start, and in some ways, not only did they not matter, they could honestly have been barriers in
Yeah.
some ways to connection with the people who were struggling in ways I had never struggled. And it changed me. It changed me. I hope it has shaped my children, and they're still becoming in so many ways, as we all are. But it's a choice that in so many ways feels, I look back on it and think, how did we land right here, and what caused us to do this? And we just didn't have a lot of support around this decision. We did it anyway. And it felt somewhat haphazard in hindsight. I don't feel like we take a lot of, like, we deserve a lot of credit for it. We just sort of followed the breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
And I am just profoundly grateful that we did.
Well, the way that you share that journey in your books, I can't help but I've got a half of a voice in my ear right now saying, I'll bet there are some listeners who might be squinting their eyes or furling their foreheads and saying, "Well, is this she moved to Goshen to? Is this some sort of white saviorism? Is this
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
sort of?" But the way that you frame this story in your book is not that at all. It is quite the opposite, and I think you hinted at it or said it in a way just now that
Mhm.
it was almost you felt like you were being saved from this race of comparison and this race
Yeah.
of sort of the
Yes.
perfect perfect comfortable quote unquote Christian lifestyle
Yeah.
life that seemed to be the track that you were on, and not only saved maybe yourself but your family and helping your kids be grounded in a real way. I find that
Yeah.
so beautiful. I want to
Yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. A couple things. I feel like, yes, we were saved from those things. I really believe that we were saved from certainty in so many ways. That was a big part of it. I just want to acknowledge, I'm glad you said it, for any of those people, like, who is this lady?
Yeah.
I appreciate the skepticism.
Yeah.
And I think it's really valuable and important. And that's part of, I can be a bit of a skeptic by nature. That's part of who I am. And to be very candid and honest. And as I try to really be candid and honest, I take any opportunity I can to tell on myself in
Mhm.
my writing, because I think it's just tremendously important to be honest about where we have been and who we have been and how we have grown. And and there certainly were some aspects when we arrived of that sort of quiet, sort of white saviorism light that we didn't even know to really check ourselves
Yeah.
against.
Yeah.
Um, but living in a place and immersing yourself in a place, it will bring those things to light. And that really is the story of the Ministry of Ordinary Places, of
Yes.
me recognizing, like, there's some baggage that I brought with me, and I need to surrender to being led by the people around me.
Yeah. So the a big central message in the heart of your writing is it's mostly subtle in the way that you share it, but you share it throughout all the books, and it grows throughout the three books. The last book becomes a little bit more blunt force in the way that you share this message, but the message is about how Jesus teaches people to live with each other, how Jesus teaches us to
Yeah.
love our neighbor, and you lean into the idea of being a neighbor, and I think that is such a inviting, easy word for us all to believe we are. And
Yeah.
then when we're asked to prove it, I think that becomes a different conversation altogether. I will tell on myself right now and say that I've spent, decades teaching people about the power of human connection and how handshakes can change the world and how deep conversations are our greatest tool. And there are people in my tiny little cul-de-sac that I am just in the evenings when it's time to go out and say hello to them, I'm like, I'm going to grumble and I'm going to sit in the house and I'm going to,
Oh, me
look
too.
at my phone.
I get it.
So,
If we can't be honest about that, then
yeah,
then what are we doing? Because I think that is there's so much fear laced around this whole conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I write a lot about this, especially in Start with Hello. I am an introvert.
Yeah.
I cannot overstate that. Like, the work is not particularly easy, but it is simple.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to communicate was, how do we do this? Certainly, the moral of this story is not that everybody should sell their house and move to another
No.
neighborhood. That happened to be just a weird impetus, like a inciting incident, as they say, for my family. But for 99% of us, I want us to be able to stand right where we are and to look around us and say, ask the question, why does it matter?
Mhm.
Why does it matter for us to just simply know the people around us? Does not mean that we're going to be best friends with them and go on vacation with them necessarily. That might be cool, but that's not the ultimate goal. The goal is, for us to live where we live, whether we chose where we live, and many of us do not get to choose where we live, but to be able to say, I don't want to live my life not being known and not knowing the people closest to me. If we can look at it from that lens, I think it starts to become pretty straightforward and obvious that, many of us who may have chosen where we live, we don't take that extra step of reckoning with, here we are. What would it look like to just actually be known by the people near us?
Yeah.
That if tragedy strikes, if, when we're celebrating, when we're suffering, when we're whatever life is throwing at us, that the people physically closest to us can step into that in some way, or we can do the same for them. And then, of course, for me, the definition of neighbor, I just stretch it for all it's worth. I mean, I'm not by any means just talking about the people who live to the left and to the right of you, but I am talking about those people.
Yeah.
Because those are the ones that we often do tend to kind of overlook. And some of us are saying, man, I've heard this from so many people since writing Start with Hello. I'm not new to the neighborhood. I've lived here for 10 years. It's pretty awkward after 10 years to be like, hey, I'm Shannan.
Yeah.
And yet it's very doable. I mean, I think it is never too late. We are always on time. And every little step we take towards living a life of connection, and just really simple, easy connection, it bolsters our life and it makes it better.
I think I'm certainly not the first person to have this thought. You're not the second person to have this thought, or the first person to have this thought. The idea that there are so many people languishing inside their homes, wanting to be known, longing
Yeah.
to be known, to be seen, living right next door to 30 other houses full of people languishing inside their home, longing to be known, longing to be seen. And the distance between our driveway and their driveway is not very far, as it turns
Right.
out. Uh, uh, man, that there are two families who moved into my little pleasant cul-de-sac in the last year, who I'm now on waving terms with, but I haven't.
Good job.
I haven't. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's worth
It is
celebrating.
good.
But I'm not on name terms with, like I
Yeah.
haven't taken the long walk,
Yeah.
60 feet from my front yard across the street to do that really simple conversation. Are there other are there other for you, when you really boil this down, when you're like, what am I really asking people to do? What are the three things you would send somebody out their front door now to do, or into their community, or even with their
Yeah.
coworkers that they often just pass by in the elevator? How do people be a neighbor today? What should
Yep.
they do?
First of all, I genuinely applaud you for being on waving terms. I think it's so important for us to acknowledge the fact that this is very slow work,
Yeah.
and that it can be slow, and that maybe it should in a lot of cases be slow, and to believe in our bones that every single bit of it counts.
Yeah.
So, I wrote a story and Start with Hello about just having months and months and months of waving to the same people, and over the course of months, one of those people ended up, you play the tape on down, and she ended up inviting me into her home. It was like that was kind of that's one way it ends.
Yeah.
But another way it ends is that your neighbors recognize you. There's something really comforting about that. And there's something, when we think of it that way, like, they know your face and you know their face. Those are the kinds of things that make us safer.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we start to feel like we're safer if we're just kind of in our own little world. And it's really the opposite that is true. So what I would say is, number one, paying attention is the absolute, like, that's like the base level, because and I mean that in the most literal way. When I started walking my kids to school and just really getting serious and intentional about learning my place, that was pretty new to me still then, kind of learning its contours, learning, paying attention to the houses, paying attention to the trees. And then over time, you start to recognize this person goes to this house. This person drives this car. And again, in my neighborhood, there are a lot of people coming and going. There are a lot of rental properties and, people moving in and out a lot of the time. And that's part of the puzzle here. But being outside in your place and paying attention to it is really worthy work that feels like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it feels like, what are we even doing here?
Yeah.
And I just want to validate that for people, that is, I couldn't have written a single word if I had not sort of fallen into the practice of just paying attention. So that's step one that we can all do. We can be taking walks. I mean, the weather might be weird in some places, but finding ways to just be out. Number two, asking for help. That feels like a big leap. But it is, but you just asked for 3 ideas. So there are a lot of other steps that we can maybe do in between.
Yeah.
But normalizing that, I mean, number one, it does kind of diminish that any sort of dormant or latent savior mentalities that some of us might be carrying. If we can reposition ourselves from the start or from the middle, wherever we happen to be, as the needy one, it kind of forces us into some important humility, and it allows our neighbors to be our hero. And we all want to be the hero. We really do. I mean, if somebody comes to me, knocks on my door and says, and this happens, we've normalized this. I've learned this from my neighbors. So let me just normalize this. This happens now. So somebody might come to my door and say, do you have 2 eggs? It's such a good feeling to be able to go to my fridge and save their day with 2 little eggs. It's a really good feeling. We have to be taking turns with that. And so if we can go first and just simply say, I need a really tall ladder. I could go to Home Depot and buy a really tall ladder that I'll use once a year, or I could ask my neighbor because I know he has one. And if I ask for help, that shows him that he can turn around and ask for help back. That's a really lovely place to kind of fall into.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I would say off sort of the top of my head is, get involved in things that are already happening in your community. So we can step away from starting something or being in charge of something, or and just looking around us. When we first moved to this community, I didn't know anybody. I had little kids. I joined the PTO and took orders. I joined the neighborhood association. We joined a church in our neighborhood. My husband joined kind of a book club type of thing with people. We got better at saying yes to opportunities as they came.
Those are 3 perfect recommendations. I want to, first of all, earlier you said it is slow work. Building relationships is slow work. Creating community is slow work. I promise I will only do this once, but I was going back through Start With Hello this morning, and there's like a 2-paragraph section about building community that, are you okay if I read this? Is it okay if we?
Of course, yeah.
This is early in the book. This is in Start With Hello again. It goes like this. We have pastors and priests and spiritual advisors to guide our faith. We have doctors and therapists to care for our bodies and minds. We have teachers to show us how to write sonnets, form hypotheses, and drive a car. But no one teaches us that community has to be built with our hands and our tender hearts and our precious time. No one breaks it all the way down. No one gives us the tools. From the outside looking in, it can seem like community just happens for the lucky few. It's easy to assume we're the ones getting it wrong. Community takes time, it takes
Yeah.
work. It's easy to complain that, you know, I think often I was writing a thing the other day specifically for churches, I was helping churches get more community. And
Yeah.
I was writing this thing that was like, it's really easy to complain that when I go to my church, nobody talks to me and it's not as social as it needs to be. And it's people aren't good at helping each other, supporting, knowing each other. Everybody just
Yeah.
stays to themselves. But it also requires that community that we desire requires that we
Yeah.
create it. It,
Yeah.
it, it, there is no other way that it is, you
Yeah.
get really lucky every once in a while and community just shows up in your life. But
Yeah.
most of the time we have to do the hard work of creating it, the
Yeah.
uncomfortable, often awkward work of creating it.
Yes. Awkward. That's something I touch on quite a bit and start with hello, because it will be.
Yeah.
And we need to just normalize that and accept it. And you know, if I had the solution to awkwardness, I would, you know, I would have a bestseller on my
Yeah.
hands. Like
Yeah.
it would, everybody in the world would have this book if I could
Yeah.
solve awkwardness.
Yeah.
But I can't. But what I can promise all of us is that we can survive it. And
Yeah.
it's a small little hurdle that we are all feeling. We all feel like we're the most awkward. We all feel like we're the ones who are going to, you know, kind of flub something up. We are all the ones longing for connection. And like you said, Matt, it just takes one of us to go first.
Yeah.
And why not us?
Yeah.
Once that rhythm starts to happen, it gives people permission and an invitation to kind of dive in. When I've been invited into things, it is a really wonderful feeling. Even if it's not, you know, even if it's not something that's going to change the rest of my life,
Yeah.
even if it's not something that I can say yes to,
Yeah.
being invited into connection is something that we can all make the intention that we're going to be just a little bit better. We're going to
Yeah.
take small steps. That's start with hello is a whole bunch of really small, simple steps that we can take that ultimately lead us towards each other and lead us towards this rich life of connection that we're looking for.
Yeah.
We can set that intention today. It's not about, you know, doing every single thing that I mentioned in the book, but it might be about this one little thing
Mhm.
stands out and we think, well, what if I tried it?
Yeah.
It's vulnerable. It's
Yeah.
vulnerable and it's awkward, and I promise you will survive it.
Yeah. I often think about awkwardness as like our sacred offering. Like the moments when
Yes.
we choose to be awkward are our sacred offering. That is the true sacrifice that we actually are asked to make in our daily lives, is
Yep.
to dive into the awkwardness of saying, I forgot your name and we've lived next to each other for,
Yes.
3 years, or the
Yep.
awkwardness on the doorstep asking for 2 eggs, the awkwardness, which by the way, those things for me are really, really hard. And I avoid them almost all the time. That's why I
Yeah.
say they are a sacred sacrifice, because
Yes.
that's what it feels like. It feels like pulling my heart out to do those things.
It can feel almost painful. It can make our bodies react in
Yeah.
interesting ways. I was talking to a group recently and saying, you know, how do we feel in our bodies when we are facing awkwardness?
Mhm.
And people had, the crowd, which had been pretty quiet up to that point, suddenly was pretty animated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
everybody had like, oh, I get butterflies in my stomach. I want to run away. I clam up. I tighten up. You know, everybody could kind of access that feeling. And yeah, I mean, I think it's, if we can kind of flip that script or that mirror, and I do this all the time. So I've written 3 books about this, and I still really deeply understand and identify with everything you just shared. That feeling of wanting to just, you know, close the door and
Mhm.
close the curtains. And what I have learned is really helpful is if I can ask myself, how would I feel if I was on the other side of this encounter?
Yeah.
how do I feel when somebody comes to my door? I think it's, if I can help them really easily, that feels great. How do I feel when somebody says, I forgot your name? I just asked your name yesterday and I already forgot it today. I do that all the time, by the
Mhm,
way.
mhm.
But when somebody just says the thing, names it, it's such a comfort to me because it's like we've set the bar at like we are just human, ordinary people. We are all kind of fighting the same things. And you have shown me now that I don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a really good place to start.
yeah. Well, while we're on the topic of awkwardness, let's talk about politics. And
Oh boy.
that's called a segue right there. Well, when I say talk about politics, we don't have to debate your position or my position or anyone else's position. I just want you to, if you're okay with it,
Yeah,
I
of
want you to
course.
tell the story of you raising your hand and jumping into the political world
Oh, yeah.
recently,
Yeah.
locally. So I want to say, first of all, that I just deeply admire anybody, especially in today's world,
Yeah.
especially in today's world fraught with division and anger and lots of just poisonous
Yeah.
stuff out there. Somebody who's willing to raise their hand and say, I'll run for office.
Yeah.
I'll try. I'll put myself out there. Will
Yep.
you I don't know a lot of the details. I've read a couple of things that you posted
Yeah.
in your newsletter and on your Instagram, but will you talk about that?
Yeah. So it was about a year ago. I was um invited to consider running for city council.
Mhm.
And I said no pretty quickly. And then another person invited me to coffee to say, would you consider? And I said, I will hear you out. And I did. And then I said, thank you. I enjoyed this conversation. My answer is still no. And so that's kind of how it went at first. I felt like I had plenty of reasons not to, and honestly, some good reasons not to,
Yeah.
some thoughtful reasons not to. And ultimately, my mind changed. Ultimately, I thought, you know what? I was able to reframe it in a way that made sense to me. And what I said a moment ago, we got better. We still might not be great at it, but we've gotten better at saying yes to things that we're invited into,
Yeah.
not indiscriminately, but to sort of default towards yes. And so I did eventually, I said yes. And so that thrust me into a political campaign, which my husband used to work for. He worked for two different United States congressmen
Oh.
when we lived in DC and then back here in the district in Indiana. And so he had been kind of on that other side of it. Like we had been kind of, I really enjoy politics. I have a lot of thoughts about it and stay pretty engaged. But running your own campaign is just a very different
Yeah.
animal. Um, and spoiler, I lost.
Yeah.
And that was maybe that's that's what I learned the most from.
Yeah.
What I learned the most was election night. I mean, I'll back up and say election day. It was just a really intense day. We were knocking on doors. We had been knocking on doors for months. It was a lot of time. It was a lot of work. And we were hopeful that I might win. And then I didn't.
Hmm.
And so it's like, what do you do then? How do you make sense of this? And for me, it was pretty simple. This process connected me to my neighbors more. I learned more about my neighborhood, the people in my neighborhood, my community. It connected me to people who have been hiding in plain sight around me, who care about some of the same things I care about.
Mhm.
I learned about the process. I experienced the process from a different perspective. I have no regrets. Um, and it's honestly humbling in a way that's probably good to be able
Yeah.
to say, I gave, like you said, I gave it my best shot and it didn't go the way I necessarily wanted it to. And that's okay.
I just there are few other full on extreme examples of living out the things that you're writing about. How do you be a neighbor? Well, what's the biggest way I could do it? I'm going to dive fully into very local politics. I'm literally going to probably knock on, more than half the doors of
Hundreds,
everybody. Yeah, 100.
right?
But I got to believe that in knocking on those doors, in having those conversations, I'm going to take a wild guess that the most powerful parts of that were not you giving your pitch for why you'd be the right person for Goshen City Council, but
Mhm.
probably more listening to the things that your neighbors needed. the things that your
Yeah.
neighbors were missing or the things that your neighbors were afraid of.
Yeah. Yes. And the thing that may have been the most meaningful to me, and it didn't fully surprise me, maybe in some ways it did, was the number of neighbors who I live in a very politically 50-50 split
Yeah.
neighborhood. And so we knew it was always going to be, a toss up. And so I would talk to people and they would say, they would grumble about this thing over here. And then I would talk to these people and they would grumble about the opposite thing over here. And so,
Mhm.
I did get to hear a lot of that. But what struck me the most is almost without exception, when I would say, do you like living here? Do you
Mhm.
like the neighborhood? They almost all said yes.
Yeah.
That to me was like revolutionary. That to me says you can have opinions, and we all do. We've got our politics, we've got our preferences, we've got our teams, or we just stay out of all of it, and that's a choice too. We can get caught up in this really polarized system of this side and that side, but at the end of the day, we're all living right here together, and we're all pretty happy about that.
Yeah.
That to me is a real hopeful lens to see the neighborhood, because again, this is a neighborhood that a lot of people are like, wow, it's kind of messy over there, it's pretty complicated over there, and that might be true, and yet there's belonging happening.
Hmm.
And so maybe there's a way. I don't really have this solved yet either, but maybe there's a way for us to to start to start coming together despite
Yeah.
these political differences. I think there's a way.
What lessons do you carry from that experience into 2024, a major election year, likely going to be a little messy as we approach November over the course of this year?
Mm-hmm.
And we're all living next door to each other. And
Yeah.
many of us are living in towns like Goshen that are our neighbors could be putting any flag out in front of their house, putting any sign out in front of their house, and
Yeah.
having real strong opinions. And those opinions are going to get louder and more
Mm-hmm.
concentrated as we approach November. What lessons do you take from that experience?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just to be a good neighbor over the course of
Yeah.
this year.
Yeah, I think knowing each other. I mean, there were neighbors I met who were never going to vote for me.
Yeah.
And yet we had really, really meaningful conversation. Um, there was always the fear that somebody might be really mean and nasty, and it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that it would never happen. And we've had in our neighborhood, we've had all of the competing flags.
Yep.
And I'm somebody, I gave people political yard signs to put in their yards. I'm not opposed to putting political yard signs
Yeah.
out, but I do kind of wish we would get away from like the nasty
Hmm.
actual flags.
Hmm.
I think maybe if we could kind of, you know, bring that temperature down a little bit to where we would be able to really see each other on a different plane.
Hmm.
Like if we could really, especially for people of faith or believers, like if we could really have our opinions and feel passionate, and I'm all about engaging and being a part of the process and being aware of what's going on, but if we could really lead with love,
Hmm.
if we could lead with love, that automatically changes things. And it's becoming more popular to lead with anger, to
Yeah.
lead with hate, to lead with name calling, to lead with, you're on my team or you're out. We can have our team, and we can still say, as neighbors, it means something that I'm right here in this place at this time and you are too.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't mean that we're destined to be enemies. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's the posture I want to carry, the posture of curiosity.
Yeah.
And there are limits, there are boundaries to these things, and there has to be, but the limit doesn't have to be anyone who disagrees with me on any level.
That's right.
We can choose to listen without necessarily agreeing. I mean, there are just postures that we can take that will help get us through, because it's going to be a tough year.
It is. It is.
It is,
The
whether we want it to
posture,
be or not.
the posture of curiosity is actually I mean, that is simple, a simple concept that people can take with them. You've talked during this conversation about just paying attention, really noticing people, being up close to people. Something the mean, angry flag flying outside of somebody's house doesn't do is it doesn't humanize the
Right.
conversation. It turns it into an abstraction. It turns it into
Yeah.
a symbol that is way up high and can have mean words on it, and that
Yeah.
doesn't do anything. But there's something about moving in, something about really being curious, paying very close attention to people, wondering about their lives, wondering about what goes on in their garage when they're in there,
Yeah.
what goes on in their real lives, right? You wrote in Start with Hello, you said, in the end, it is only our tender attention to each other that will make the world safer, brighter, truer. Only our tender attention to each other.
Mm.
And for me, that's a posture I want to take into this
Yeah.
year. I want to give people tender attention, because if I take that posture, if I show up with that stance, uh, I think only good can come from it. I think we can
I
find
think
each
so.
other again.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if we can, if one of us listening decides that, okay, I'm gonna kind of keep that as one of my sort of North Stars for this next year in
Yeah.
this political season that we're in. If one person does that, and that positively affects one other person in their place or neighborhood and brings them into connection, that makes the world more connected.
Yeah. That's
I
right.
mean, the math just always checks out. If we can be, if the world becomes more connected for one person, the world has become more connected.
Yeah.
And we just keep working towards that. We don't have to live this next year in despair or in, just numbing out and ignoring the hard stuff happening around us, or in defeat. That we can really find ways to navigate this well. We
Yeah.
really, really can.
What your books have been a gift to me. This conversation has been like a little highlight
Oh,
of quite a while. I'm just delighted to get to meet you and to talk to you and to learn from you. What are you working on right now? What are you excited about right now? What's next for Shannan Martin?
yeah. Well, I work in the kitchen tomorrow. That's the next thing for
Yeah,
me. So I'll be cooking something in the kitchen. I
yeah,
always look forward to that. In terms of writing, I'm just kind of in the idea phase of what my next book might be. And so that's always kind of a fun and frustrating,
yeah,
mostly
yeah.
fun part of that process. But I'm really leaning into my Substack community. I'm still active on Instagram most days. It's a space I still love, but I'm focusing more and more of my attention and energy into just a really lovely community of people who are interested in carrying this, and
Yeah.
carrying the beauty with the complexity. And that's what we're all about. We are having good conversations over there about these very things we've talked about today, like how are we going to do this for the next year,
Yeah.
and how are we going to find our way back to each other, or find each other in the first place. So yeah, you can find my Substack. You can find my Instagram and follow along there. I'd love to have you.
Your Substack's called The Soup. Is that right?
It's called The Soup. I think that I should have the answer to this, but if you want to find it, you can just Google Shannan Martin Substack,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I forget which, if it's the Shannan Martin that comes first or the Substack. These details, yeah,
Are
they're not my
not,
strength.
they're also not vital. Everybody's got
Yeah,
Google now.
you can
It'll be
Google it.
just
Yep.
fine. Yeah.
And my website is shannonmartin.com. I can tell you that for sure. Links to all my books, links to my Substack, links to my Instagram. Yes, that's where you can find everything, including my famous pickle recipe.
Oh yeah.
There's some fun little goodies over there. So
Well, anyone with a famous pickle recipe, anyone who is a master at soup, I think you're in the book, in one of the books, I think you refer to yourself in your work in the community kitchen. That's called the window, right?
it is,
Yeah.
yes.
In
Yep.
your work there, I think you titled yourself Chief Bacon Officer, or you have held that title
Right.
there at some
Yes.
point. Food
Yes,
is a food.
esteemed title.
Yeah, yeah, that's important. Food is a very good way to create a sacred space
That's
between
right.
you and others. And
And it
I,
doesn't have to be hard.
no,
Doesn't have
no.
to be complicated. I'm a foodie, so any foodies out there, a good friend of mine used to be the local food critic, and I think it was after he read The Ministry of Ordinary Places, but he said, I didn't know when I picked this up that I was going to be reading a food book.
There are a
Food
lot
finds
of
its
food.
way
Yeah.
into a lot of my writing, so take that as you will.
Shannon, I can't wait to listen back to this because I feel like we hit some really fun things. And I want to thank you for being a real person. I feel like it's easy to, you've been on a lot of podcasts, you've written a few books, you know, this format. And it's probably easy to just sort of get in a mode of, you know, I'm going to say the same things I've said before. I've got my talking points. Let's
Yeah,
get this over with. But I'm so grateful. This was a real conversation.
me
This
too.
was sacred for me, and I deeply appreciate it.
I loved it. Thanks for being just a thoughtful listener and conversation partner and for having me on.
Yeah. Thanks, Shannon. Hey, thanks to all you betweeners out there for listening to this episode of the Between Podcast. Make sure you visit between.church on the internet to sign up for our mailing list. That's probably the most important thing, our email list. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. You can check out our 5-minute sermons, 5-ish minute sermons that we post every week. Follow us on social media. We got daily prayers. We got all sorts of other content. And join our community fully. We invite everyone. You are welcome here, no matter who you are or where you're from, no matter what you believe or even if you believe, no matter who you love or how you love, no matter what anybody else has ever told you about you. You are welcome and loved and celebrated here at Between. You know, my favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.